be best for, be most comfortable for you. What I want to do is an oral history of the 60s. And Austin's an interesting area because there's a major university with a lot of anti-war. There was a segregation case, a very famous law case here in 1959. There's been an awful lot of work with the Valley farm workers, the Chicanos. Plus, we've got the Rostows here. We've got all of LBJ's legacy. Basically, Austin's sort of conservative, but with the university and the state capitol here, it pretty much is a microcosm of the whole history of the 60s. Almost anything that happened elsewhere happened here, including some very good writers, some very good music, because Janis Joplin came from here, and Steve Miller Band, things like that. Now, what I want to do for this oral history is we don't want to just take one half, we want to take it over all levels, and so chances are when we put this program together,
What's your name?
Brian
Brian.
Owens. Now, if you ever have need for this tape or anything, we'll keep it in archives, and anybody's welcome to use it.
What group is this?
We're Austin Community Television, and we have a cable channel, much like the public access channel in New York, where we program from 7 to 10 every night. We do not just alternative television, but everything from 6th graders football to League of Women Voters to, in fact, the greatest program I'd ever like to do is I'd love to shoot you singing with the Country Western Band. That would be a...
I get some musicians.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a bit.
Okay, what going, Brian?
Okay, the first question I have is, as a writer, as a poet, the 60s you responded differently. From 1960 to 1969, there was a whole evolution as a writer in your poetry, in your response. You started off, we know your late 50s poetry was actually a preface to the whole 60s. You very early recognized that there were an awful lot of in your poetry, you made a political statement.
I was just making personal statements.
Or personal statement, but it was a personal gut reaction.
Well, yeah, so I think that the personal statements made, let's say, by Kerouac or Burroughs or Gregory Corso or myself in the 50s were different from official political statements, and that's why it was considered somewhat social or political, because we were expressing our individual opinions rather than the official opinion.
But
and I guess that was the message, that people had individual opinions and had individual universes, and their experience was different from the mass consciousness of the media.
When the 60s came, though, when John F. Kennedy was elected, did you discern any difference in your own personal reaction to the depraved minds of society that
Depraved.
Well,
my mind was depraved. That was my personal reaction, that I was depraved, and everybody else going around as if they were just to swallow a canary or something. Everybody else was making believe they weren't depraved.
And your poetry was a recognition of your condition.
Our era was like an announcement of some kind of wedding cake reality that didn't really exist. That is to say, everybody sucked cock or made love with their eyes open or smoked grass, or at least the people in my world, and had all sorts of odd premonitions about the CIA was behind LSD, or the CIA was overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran and putting in some dictator, or the FBI was beating up on blacks and causing problems and persecuting black leaders. So there was a large social paranoia, which at first was considered on our part to be nutty, fruitcake, rather than just sort of direct perception of what was going on.
Your reaction wasn't necessarily political because it wasn't so conscious that, this is wrong, as we're going to act.
Well, I still don't think in terms of right and wrong exactly. I think in terms of what do I actually feel, and then what is it that the government and the media or the all-rightniks are telling me to feel. And there's a big difference.
But you're
say, as with gay liberation, for instance. Let's say I was in India at the beginning of the 60s, exploring Hindu and Buddhist meditation. And my main interest in the 50s and 40s, my poetry begins in the 40s. My main interest was in awareness, like enlarging the area of my own awareness. Widening the area of consciousness was the sort of tagline I put on the end of a book, Kaddish, that I published in the early 60s.
Mhm.
The message is, quote, widen the area of consciousness. A little vague. I would define it now I would give a tool for doing that now by saying simple slow down meditation.
There was a tremendous amount of energy, as I remember, in the beginning of Dharma Bums and later in Big Sur about the India quest. I mean, the consciousness. But it was also
Related to Back to the Land and a rediscovery of America as an actual place in the Indian America. Discovery, Kerouac's phrase, the earth is an Indian thing. Nice phrase. The earth is an Indian thing. Meaning there were people that lived here before us that actually knew the names of the flowers and knew the medicinal uses of the flowers growing by what are now side roads. And knew what the arrangement of the stars was in heaven, or knew which way the wind blew.
But you mix this not only with Indian religion, but with Japanese, with the Zen Buddhism.
Yeah, but that was like looking around the world to see if other people had same problems and how other people had explored their own minds and explored their own emotions and looked into themselves to see if there was if the problem was themselves or the world or the universe, whether they should get mad at themselves or the universe.
Did you also see,
Or not get mad at it.
when you were
Just try and dig what's going on here.
when you were reading, in fact, when you were sort of
Then, see, as a result of, say, if I smoke grass and I realize grass ain't so bad for you, not so good, not so bad, just nothing special, then if you have a whole bunch of whole giant police agency and local cops going around busting people like Stony Burns around here some time back, or Dallas, or actually I lived in Texas in '48, actually near New Waverly, with William Burroughs, and we had a little marijuana plantation, a very small garden. We were looking out from a private world on a public world that seemed somewhat hallucinated and foolish, and bound to crash. The public world bound to crash because it was built on self-deception and lies and
how did
greed, passion, grabbing, ignorance. In this case, around here, I suppose a heavy petroleum addiction, which was bound to lead to some kind of bring down withdrawal symptoms.
an awful lot of Burroughs, Kerouac, and your poetry is pretty much characterized by experience, going out, sort of doing. If anybody could do poetry, it was done poetry. Kerouac did poetry.
Spoken,
Burroughs,
vocalized.
spoken, and then
For my case, Kerouac also was a great.
and then it
speaker.
was later chronicled, and that would become the work.
Mhm.
So you had a very different feeling that poetry was poetry. I would characterize Kerouac as more of a poet than a novelist.
Yeah.
That
Yes. Yeah, I do. I think he's a great poet. I learned my poetry from him. The idea was that everyday speech could be full of grapefruits and swimming pools.
that action could be poetry too, though. There was a certain movement. There's a
That
certain
action was theater in the sense that we saw ourselves on Earth for the one and only time, and so realized that we had no permanent essence or no permanent identity, but we're like phantoms, taking care of each other's ghosts. So that we spoke as ghosts.
This was Kerouac's ghost and On the Road, I guess. The
Yes.
person that he was, in fact, it goes throughout his works. There's always a phantom.
Texas ghost, actually. So we could ghost he sees on the road outside of Laredo or somewhere.
Mm.
He said, "What the ghost have to say?" Wow. I think that was his mantra. Wow. Amazement of being alive.
When the 60s came on, and there was a large generation that sort of empathized with what you were doing, and soon
That's a nice word, empathize.
and then soon glorified it. You, William Burroughs, and Jack Kerouac reacted in 3 different ways, if I'm not mistaken. Burroughs reacted to it in some ways the most radically, and he went into form. Kerouac at some point reassessed what was going on and was frightened by it, and you sort of got right distressed.
I would say by the aggression, by what he felt was maybe the nastiness and aggression parading itself as prophecy. And so he had a very good insight into what my flaws of character were. I think, and kind of struck me in the heart at the time, and have been a seed which I've nurtured and thought of since. That to what extent is public behavior taking our private behavior and carrying out into the public? To what extent is that a play of egotism and aggression and grasping, or to what extent is it a simple trying to rest in a calm center and speak truthfully? So I've had to be mindful of that, and I'm grateful for him for his conservatism there, because I've had to be mindful not to come into excesses of self-righteousness.
Does that mean when you go out and speak to campuses, you try to make it maybe a month or 2 months together, and so you can get away from it for 4 or 5 months at a time, and not become a
No,
public?
I'm intermittent. I run in and out. My life is upside down different ways. For one thing, it led me more and more to meditation, to practicing meditation, Chogyam Trungpa in the Tibetan style, shamatha, just to increase mindfulness, just to carry out in really practical fashion what was originally ambitioned, which was widen the area of consciousness. Well, if you actually do practice some kind of sitting Buddhist style in this sense, you actually do have time to look around you and smell your own breath, so to speak.
But you also, rather than just sitting and meditating, you had more active
Yeah, I did.
Buddhism.
When I went out, I said what I thought I had on my mind. The first thing that came to my head. I didn't have a particular program. It was just that I felt it was necessary for me, at least as a poet, to just actually try and be frank about what was going on in my head. I didn't have to be right or wrong, to simply represent what I was actually thinking as distinct from what I think I might thought of I should be thinking, or somebody might think I might be thinking. So the question was always to return to ordinary mind, or to represent ordinary mind, or actually speak frankly, with truthfulness of a kind. It's a little bit boastful, but at least to attempt to stick to the facts, rather than make a theory or make a grand plan or alibi or hide. So that led to a lot of frank speech about, say, in my case, homosexual loves, or drugs, of course, or use of drugs, and personal reactions to it, which were much more informal and charming than the official philippics issuing from the offices of the local narcs who were working with the mafia. Because of the war, I was in India, and I went through Saigon in the early 60s, in 62, and I got a good look and saw David Halberstam, and met a lot of the reporters there, and realized that what was being sprayed out on TV across America was totally different from what those reporters thought right on the scene. That they knew it was a loser, moral loser, and a physical loser all along. But my father, who was living in Paterson, New Jersey in 1965, still thought that the Vietnamese wanted us there to protect them from the commies, which is a big mistake, because they didn't want us there at all.
When you came to Austin in I believe it was the fall of 1967, you were coming basically to, this is Lyndon B. Johnson's backyard.
Yeah. It was a long poem saying that I here declare the end of the war. Lyndon Johnson could escalate it, but I hereby declare the end of it. Just simply opposing my own imagination against his. There's a funny line by Abby Hoffman. It says, we have the right to shout theater at a crowded fire. As they said, they had a crowded fire there, and they didn't know it. The fire of their own egos, probably. Rostow's ego. Aggression.
I'm wondering, when you came here in 1967, you met Roger Shattuck.
Yes.
And you talked quite extensively with Roger Shattuck. And that evening, you met a lot of students, not just at the law forum, but outside.
Yeah.
And there must have been 1,000 students in Austin around the campus, non-students. And as I remember, there were torches. People were carrying torches.
I remember that.
And
I remember giving a long speech on LSD legislation to the law forum, and also giving them a history of the malevolence and the illegality of the manipulations of the narcotics bureaus from 1918 on, and pointing out that the narcotics bureaus themselves were corrupt and were just basically a lobby for organized crime, in a sense.
Also, you gave long chant. In fact, you had several chants.
Yeah, I was doing Buddhist or Hindu chanting. That's what I like to say. I had a very complicated intellectual issue to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I was nervous. What am I doing in the middle of all these people? I got to open my mouth and yatter. Or Carol back in the back of my mind saying, "What are you trying? You need a dirty Jew trying to show his teeth in public." So I thought best first rest my head, anybody else's head by localizing, particularizing our attention in one spot, maybe breath, or slowing down and observing the breath. Perhaps for the chanting, lowering the voice to some area in the center of the body, rather than screaming hysterically, and trying to create a little space where thought forms could be examined.
When you traveled to a place like Austin and you gave a speech, like you're here right now,
Mm-hmm.
to give a speech,
To give a poetry reading.
Give a poetry reading. I'm
And
sorry.
Sing.
Would,
And sing.
does
And
the,
get laid, maybe.
does the character or the environment can you relate to this place as being Austin, Texas? Can you relate to some place as being Lubbock,
I have friends here,
Texas?
like Doug Sohm and Kinky Friedman and others. So I'm sort of interested in their local scene. I was on the phone to Kinky Friedman's mother just now. First of all, since it's the capital of Texas and LBJ and John Connolly's ghost is around, there's the assembled ghosts of all the petrochemical wizards and the wheelers and dealers, and it's sort of that's very impressive in the sense that there's this ironic realization that it's a doomed civilization in the sense that the petroleum runs out, and what can they do? Maybe replace it with some uranium, which is poison, but that it's like a centralized energy producing state. It's like a centralization of energy. All that fossil fuel, which accumulated for billions of years, which is being spent, in a century, to soup up everybody like amphetamine. And there is a realization of the meth head nature of all this progress around. The meth freak, meth head, nervous building that's going on, like about the meth addicts building their buildings and pasting together all their pieces of paper and making their collages at the LBJ library. A very slow meth head thing. Or at least that's the vision I get occasionally.
What I was curious about in 1968 when you came here, and you had a very similar feeling because that's what Austin is characterized by. It was, I guess, your first visit to Austin, probably in the 60s.
Yeah.
And yet
what was amazing was actually the local culture. Home local culture.
That's what I was going to say. You had an awful lot of response.
Yeah.
Now I was curious in terms of what you thought it was going to be like and what had happened. Did that in any way, was that telling as to your status in the 60s counterculture, or?
I wasn't thinking about that so much.
No. I mean, but in terms of reacting to you.
What is the nature of my mind and others? What is it? What's the actual? What thought did I have a few seconds ago? And is that something I could say aloud? Trying to remember myself.
Oh, and when you had to interact with
well, anytime
an awful lot of people.
Now I'm talking, but what am I thinking then? So, am I saying what I'm thinking? How close am I to an accurate representation of what I'm actually feeling? But what I was finding was that there are a lot of people that were quite open-minded and were quite close themselves to what they were actually feeling, and had built a local culture with a lot of music and a lot of great beginnings of actually some alternative awareness as grew up here in the Austin Sun with Jeff Nightberg, who was a friend later. I was amazed by the openness of the actual musicians and students.
There's also an awful lot of
the funk, the local
funk.
The hard funk.
People in Austin tend to celebrate Austin too.
Well, everybody should celebrate their own home ground. That was, I think, the lesson of the American Indians. The earth is an Indian thing. In other words, this earth actually belongs to us in the sense of this is the place we know best. And so your own town is your own holy land.
And
with all of its mad generals.
Has that been true in an awful lot of the places you've gone? Do you think there's this?
This is the center of the universe.
No, well.
Sure. That's the way. That's the whole point of the universe.
No, but in
Every
terms of
place in it is the center of it.
in terms of the people there in those different cities and towns and in New York City itself,
Everybody has his own character.
do they recognize the character around them?
Well, I think that was one of the results of Kerouac's illumination that people began is seeing through his eyes, recognizing the nature of the place around them, their own nature, their own self-nature, and appreciating it. You know, like redeeming themselves and their friends for their own weird character of being on Earth right now, thinking and talking, making love, and aware of the fact that nobody's going to be here forever.
It seems central to Kerouac in his novels that this interaction. He gives you so much conversation, so much interaction, and I think one of the chief attractions of Kerouac to young people and to me and friends is that that interaction, that idea of friendship, or that our interaction is somehow much more interesting and important than
And the stars.
the stars.
Yeah, to us it is. And the stars are only stars, real stars.
But then thoughts
If
about
their interactions are honest and mellow and self-recognizing also, and show some sort of sign of recognition of that nature, the nature that we all share, sort of aware, which is the awareness, the sort of accommodating awareness of self, and the accommodating awareness of the peculiarity and charm of our own heroism and folly, sort of forgiveness of our own folly.
Well, it's a centering. I guess partially what you're saying is a centering on our own experience and our own life field and our own.
Well, observing it at any rate, instead of trying to escape it, wanting to go to Paris and be a big fairy or something. The big fairy in Boston instead.
His dialogue, although also shows an awful lot of play.
Yeah.
Between people, and it's that way in life.
Yes, it is.
They
I guess that was characteristic of the '60s. That recognition of gangs of people like the Beatles, gangs of people with tremendous amount of